My name is Madison Reynolds, 27, and I still remember that phone call like it was yesterday. I sold your house to teach you a lesson about respect. My stepmother, Brenda, sneered over the phone. The new owners move in next week. My hand didn't even tremble as I held the receiver. I smiled, remembering the secret meeting with my late father's lawyer. Good luck with that, I replied simply. She had absolutely no idea what was coming. Dad had made sure of that before cancer. Took him from us last year. Before I dive into this wild family drama, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your location in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe to hear more stories about family justice that will leave you speechless. The house at the center of this story wasn't just any house. It was a stunning Victorian in Boston's historic Beacon Hill neighborhood. All red brick, black shutters, and ornate moldings that dated back to 1887. My grandparents had purchased it in the 1950s for what now seems like an unbelievable price, and they'd left it to my father, their only child. That house had been the backdrop for every significant memory of my childhood. Dad was an architect with his own successful firm, and he taught me to appreciate every inch of that home's craftsmanship. On Sunday mornings, while most kids were watching cartoons, Dad would walk me through different rooms, pointing out the hand-carved balusters on the staircase, the original heart pine floors, and the intricate plasterwork on the ceilings. "Madison," he'd say, running his fingers along the crown molding, "they don't make homes like this anymore. This craftsmanship is a lost art." He'd lift me up to touch the ceiling medallions, explaining how they were created by artisans who had immigrated from Italy. "This house is our legacy, Maddie. Someday it'll be yours to care for." My mother, Elizabeth, loved that house just as much as Dad did. She'd been an interior designer with an eye for blending modern comfort with historical integrity. Together, my parents had created spaces that were both breathtaking and livable. The jewel-tone library with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, the kitchen with its soapstone counters and chef-grade appliances tucked discreetly behind period-appropriate cabinetry. The sunroom where Mom had nursed her collection of rare orchids. But our perfect life fractured when Mom was diagnosed with aggressive breast cancer when I was 13. For 2 years, our home transformed into a place of hushed conversations and medical equipment. The sunroom became Mom's sanctuary during treatment, where she could still feel the warmth of the sun when she was too weak to go outside. I was 15 when we lost her. Dad and I were devastated in different ways. I became withdrawn, spending hours in my room or in Mom's sunroom talking to her plants as if they could hear me. Dad threw himself into work, sometimes sleeping at his office rather than coming home to a house filled with Mom's absence. For nearly 2 years, it was just the two of us muddling through our grief together. Then came the charity gala for cancer research. Dad went to honor Mom's memory, and that's where he met Brenda Campbell. Brenda was everything my mother wasn't. Loud, flashy, and attention-seeking. Where my mother had been thoughtful and genuine, Brenda was calculated and performative. But she made Dad laugh for the first time in years, and I couldn't begrudge him that, even when she started showing up at our house for dinner 3 times a week. "Be nice to Brenda," Dad would say before she arrived. "She makes me happy, Maddie." So I tried. I genuinely tried. But from the beginning, Brenda made it clear that our house wasn't to her taste. "This place is so old," she'd say, running a manicured finger along our antique sideboard. "Wouldn't it be nice to update things? Get rid of some of this dark wood. Brighten the place up." Each suggestion felt like an eraser of my mother. The dated wallpaper in the dining room that Mom had carefully selected. The old-fashioned clawfoot tub that Mom and I used to take bubble baths in when I was little. The cluttered bookshelves filled with volumes that contained my mother's notes in the margins. When Dad announced their engagement after only 8 months of dating, I forced a smile and congratulated them. I was 17 then, and I told myself I only needed to endure Brenda for 1 year before college would provide me an escape. The wedding was lavish. Brenda's choice, not Dad's. He would have preferred something intimate, like his first wedding to my mother in our backyard garden. Instead, we had a 200-person extravaganza at one of Boston's premium hotels. I stood beside them as the maid of honor, watching as Brenda beamed at the photographer rather than at my father during their vows. After the honeymoon, things changed rapidly. Brenda began redecorating immediately. Room by room, my mother's touch disappeared from our home. The antique Persian rugs were replaced with modern geometric patterns. The warm colors gave way to stark whites and grays. Family photos were rearranged to prominently feature Brenda, with many of the ones featuring just Dad and Mom and me disappearing altogether. Dad seemed oblivious at first. Or perhaps he was just grateful not to be alone anymore. When I tried to talk to him about it, he'd brush off my concerns. "Your mother would want us to move forward, Maddie." He'd say, "Brenda needs to feel like this is her home too." But it went beyond redecorating. Brenda began inserting herself between Dad and his longtime friends. The couples that had been fixtures at our dinner table for years were suddenly too boring or stuck in the past. Dad's college roommate, who visited every summer, was now imposing. His sister, my Aunt Carol, was always criticizing Brenda, though I'd never heard Aunt Carol say an unkind word about anyone. Gradually, our social circle shrank to Brenda's friends and colleagues. Dad seemed to shrink too, deferring to Brenda on matters he once would have decided confidently on his own. By the time I left for college at UCLA, as far from Boston as I could reasonably go, Dad was calling me less frequently, always when Brenda was out. Our conversations felt rushed and guarded. When I'd ask about coming home for a weekend, there was always some reason why it wasn't a good time. Brenda was hosting a work event. Brenda was remodeling the guest room. Brenda thought it would be better if I visited during scheduled breaks when they could properly prepare. So I adapted. I spent holidays with friends, or with Aunt Carol, who had been similarly exiled. I focused on my studies, double majoring in architecture and historic preservation, a tribute to both my parents that went unrecognized by my father. Still, Dad found ways to maintain our connection. He'd send care packages to my dorm with notes, saying, "Don't tell Brenda how much chocolate I sent." He'd make business trips to California that conveniently coincided with my semester breaks. During these stolen moments, I'd catch glimpses of my real father, the one who laughed easily and spoke passionately about his projects, the one who wasn't constantly checking his phone to respond to Brenda's texts. During my senior year of college, Dad surprised me by flying out for a weekend alone. "Brenda thinks I'm at a conference in Chicago," he confessed as we walked along the Santa Monica Pier. "I needed to see you, Maddie, to talk to you without interference." That day, he asked detailed questions about my life, my studies, my goals after graduation. He seemed particularly interested in my thesis project on adaptive reuse of historic properties. "You have your mother's eye and my technical mind," he said proudly. "The perfect combination." Before he left, he hugged me tighter than usual. "I've made some mistakes, Madison," he said, using my full name as he always did when he was serious. "But I want you to know that you are the most important person in my life. Never doubt that." I didn't know then that he was saying goodbye in his way. I didn't know that he'd already received his diagnosis. The call came on a Tuesday morning during my first year working at a historic preservation firm in San Francisco. Aunt Carol's voice was tight with both grief and anger. "Your father's sick. Madison. It's cancer, pancreatic, and it's advanced. The doctors are giving him months, not years." The shock hit me physically, making my knees buckle as I sat heavily in my office chair. How long has he known? At least 6 weeks from what I can gather. Brenda's been controlling who gets information and when. I only found out because I ran into James from your dad's firm. I was on a plane that afternoon. During the 5-hour flight, my mind raced through all the signs I might have missed. Dad had looked thinner when we video chatted last month. He'd seemed tired, but I'd attributed that to a big project he was finishing. He'd mentioned stomach pain, but blamed it on Brenda's experimental cooking face. When I arrived at the house, my house, Our house. Though it hardly looked the same anymore. Brenda answered the door with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Madison, what a surprise, she said, blocking the entrance slightly. We weren't expecting you. I came as soon as I heard about Dad, I said, refusing to play along with her charade. Where is he? Your father is resting. The medication makes him very tired. Perhaps you should have called first. From behind her, I heard Dad's voice, weak but insistent. Is that Maddie? Let her in. Brenda. She stepped aside reluctantly, and I rushed past her to the downstairs study, which had been converted to a bedroom for Dad. The sight of him nearly broke me. The robust, energetic man who had taught me to ride a bike and build model bridges was now thin and jaundiced, his designer clothes hanging loose on his frame, but his eyes lit up when he saw me, and for a moment, he was just my dad again. Madison, he said, reaching for me. My girl, you came. I sat beside him, taking his hand carefully, afraid of dislodging the 4 that ran to a port in his chest. Of course I came. Why didn't you tell me sooner? He glanced toward the door where Brenda hovered. We didn't want to worry you until we had a treatment plan in place. I bit back my response. There was no we in this situation. I knew with absolute certainty that Brenda had kept this from me deliberately, likely hoping Dad would be too sick to see me by the time I found out. Over the next few weeks, I took a leave of absence from my job and moved back into my old bedroom, which Brenda had thankfully not yet converted to the home gym she'd been planning. I coordinated with Dad's doctors, arranged for a home health nurse, and spent every possible moment with him. Brenda was visibly annoyed by my presence, but couldn't object without seeming heartless. Instead, she found subtle ways to assert her control, rescheduling nurse visits without telling me, accidentally discarding the soft foods I prepared for Dad, insisting on accompanying him to appointments where she would speak over both of us. But she couldn't be there all the time. She had her real estate business to run, and social obligations she deemed too important to miss despite my father's condition. During these precious hours alone with Dad, we reconnected in a way we hadn't been able to in years. I'm sorry, Maddie, he told me one afternoon as we looked through old family albums I'd rescued from the attic. I let her come between us. Between me and everyone who mattered. It's okay, Dad, I said, though we both knew it wasn't. No, it's not. I was weak. After your mother died, I was so lost. Brenda was decisive when I couldn't be strong when I felt broken. But that strength, it became a wall. I see that now. On days when he felt stronger, Dad would ask me to help him to the sunroom, the one space Brenda hadn't completely redesigned, perhaps because she rarely used it. There, surrounded by the offspring of my mother's, beloved plants that the housekeeper had quietly continued to tend, Dad began to have mysterious private conversations with me. I need you to understand something, Madison, he said one day, his voice barely above a whisper. Things aren't always what they seem. I've made arrangements to make things right. What kind of arrangements, Dad? I asked. But he shook his head. Not now. After. I need you to promise me you'll meet with Harrison, my attorney, after I'm gone. No matter what happens at the reading of the will. Promise me. I promise. I said, confused but unwilling to stress him by pressing for details. As the weeks passed and Dad grew weaker, I noticed Brenda's attention shifting from his care to his possessions. She began asking him pointed questions about his business, about accounts and properties. She became particularly fixated on the house. We should discuss selling, Richard, she said one evening when she thought I was out of earshot. This place is too big for me to manage alone. Too many stairs, too much maintenance. We could use the money for your treatments. Dad's insurance covered his treatments, and they both knew it. The house was worth millions in Boston's hot real estate market. And Brenda, who'd come into the marriage with comparatively modest assets, clearly had her eye on the potential windfall. Not yet. Dad would reply weakly. Let's focus on getting better first. But we all knew he wasn't getting better. The treatments had failed to shrink the tumors, and Dad had decided to stop them, preferring quality of life over a slightly prolonged, painful existence. During his final week, Dad insisted on speaking to me alone each day. These conversations were often fragmented, jumping between childhood memories and urgent instructions. The oak tree in the backyard. Remember how we built that treehouse? Harrison has the papers. Your mother's jewelry is in the safe deposit box. Key in my desk. Harrison knows. Trust Harrison. I nodded and took notes, unsure what was delirium and what was important information. The night before he died, Dad had a moment of perfect lucidity. He gripped my hand with surprising strength and looked directly into my eyes. Madison, I need you to forgive me for Brenda for the lost years. But know this. I've always loved you more than anything in this world, and I've done everything I could to protect you. Remember that when it seems like I didn't. I held his hand against my cheek, memorizing the feel of it. There's nothing to forgive, Dad. I love you. He died peacefully the next morning with me on one side of his bed and Brenda on the other. In that moment of profound loss, I thought perhaps grief might bridge the gap between Brenda and me, that we might find common ground in loving and missing the same man. I was wrong. While I sat shell-shocked beside my father's body, Brenda was already on the phone with the funeral director, planning a service that would reflect her taste rather than Dad's wishes. The funeral was exactly as Brenda wanted it. Elaborate floral arrangements Dad would have found excessive eulogies from her friends who barely knew him. A reception at an upscale hotel, rather than the intimate gathering at home that Dad had specified in the notes I'd found in his desk. Throughout the service, Brenda played the part of the devastated widow perfectly, accepting condolences with a practiced balance of dignity and visible grief. Yet, I noticed how quickly her expression changed when she thought no one was watching. The tears drying up instantly, the look of calculation returning to her eyes as she assessed the attendees, likely mentally cataloging who would be useful to her moving forward. I stood beside her in the receiving line, accepting hugs from Dad's colleagues and friends, many of whom I hadn't seen in years, due to Brenda's systematic isolation of my father. The fact that she'd brought her own lawyer suggested she was expecting something contentious. I glanced at Aunt Carol, who had arrived just after me, and she raised an eyebrow slightly. "Shall we begin?" Mr. Harrison said once we were all seated. He opened a thick folder and cleared his throat. "This is the last will and testament of Richard James Reynolds, revised and signed 6 months ago with myself and 2 colleagues as witnesses. Months ago, just before Dad's diagnosis, if my timeline was correct." Mr. Harrison began with the standard legal preamble, then moved to the specific bequests. Dad's collection of architectural books to his firm, a generous donation to the Cancer Research Foundation established in my mother's name, his vintage car to his oldest friend from college. Then came the items that mattered most. To my daughter, Madison Elizabeth Reynolds, I leave my personal effects, including photographs, my architectural drafting tools, and the family albums. I felt my stomach drop. Personal effects. That's all. Additionally to Madison, I leave a cash bequest of $50,000. $50,000 was generous under normal circumstances, but given my father's wealth and our family history, it felt like an afterthought. I could feel Brenda's smirk without even looking at her. "The remainder of my estate," Mr. Harrison continued, "including all real property, financial accounts, investments, and business interests, I leave to my wife, Brenda Campbell Reynolds." The words hit me like physical blows. The house, my childhood home, my grandparents' legacy, the place my father had promised would someday be mine to care for, was now Brenda's, along with everything else that defined my father's life and work. How could he do this? After all his mysterious comments about making things right, After all his hints about arrangements and instructions to meet with Harrison, I must have made some small sound of distress because Aunt Carol reached over and gripped my hand tightly. "Are there any questions?" Mr. Harrison asked, looking directly at me with an unreadable expression. Brenda's attorney spoke up. "Everything seems quite straightforward. My client is satisfied with the terms." I bet she was. In the space of 10 minutes, Brenda had gone from a moderately successful real estate agent to a multimillionaire with significant property holdings. "Madison?" Mr. Harrison prompted any questions. I wanted to scream, to demand explanations, to ask how my father could have betrayed not just me, but the generations of Reynolds who had preserved our family home. Instead, I managed a stiff no questions. "Very well," Mr. Harrison said. "There are papers to sign regarding the transfer of assets. Brenda, my assistant, has those ready in the next room. Madison, if you could stay behind for a moment. There are some details regarding your father's personal effects that we need to discuss." Brenda rose, triumphant. "Take all the time you need to discuss knickknacks," she said. "I have more pressing matters to attend to, like deciding what color to paint the living room. I'm thinking white to brighten up all that dreary woodwork." She swept out with her attorney, leaving me stunned and shaking with both grief and anger. As soon as the door closed behind them, Mr. Harrison's formal demeanor changed. He quickly crossed to a sideboard, poured a glass of water, and brought it to me. "Drink this," he instructed gently, and then listened very carefully. "All is not as it appears, Madison." I took the water automatically, my mind still reeling. "What do you mean?" "She got everything. The house, the money, everything he worked for." "Not exactly," he said, his voice lowered conspiratorially. He reached into an inner pocket of his suit jacket and withdrew a small envelope. "Your father asked me to give you this privately after the formal reading, and he asked me to tell you that you must meet me tomorrow at 10 a.m. at the Blackbird Cafe on Charles Street. Come alone. Tell no one." I took the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside was a note in my father's handwriting. "Madison, what you heard today is not the full story. Harrison will explain everything tomorrow. Trust him completely. Remember what I told you. Things aren't always what they seem. I've made arrangements. I love you more than anything, Dad." I looked up at Mr. Harrison, confused hope beginning to replace my despair. "I don't understand." "You will," he promised. "Tomorrow, for now, play along. Let Brenda believe she's won. It's what your father wanted." As I drove away from the attorney's office, I glanced in my rearview mirror at the house that had been my home. The house I thought I'd never see again except as a visitor at Brenda's mercy. I watched her go inside, already on her phone, likely sharing the news of her windfall with friends. Later that evening, as I sat in Aunt Carol's guest room trying to make sense of the day's events, I received a text from a high school friend who still lived in the neighborhood. "Just drove by your house. There's a coming soon sign from Brenda's real estate company in the front yard." "Is your dad selling?" My dad wasn't selling. My dad was gone, and Brenda wasn't wasting any time claiming her prize and turning it into cash. The Blackbird Cafe was a small, unassuming establishment tucked between a bookstore and a florist on Charles Street. It was the kind of place locals treasured and tourists overlooked, with mismatched furniture and the best scones in Boston. Dad and I used to come here on Saturday mornings when I was in high school. I arrived 15 minutes early, too anxious to wait any longer at Aunt Carol's. I chose a table in the back corner, positioned so I could see both the entrance and the emergency exit, a habit from my years living in San Francisco. At precisely 10 Ys, Mr. Harrison appeared, carrying a weathered leather briefcase that looked like it had accompanied him through decades of legal practice. He ordered coffee for both of us before sitting down across from me. "Thank you for coming, Madison," he said, his formal tone contrasting with the casual setting. "What I'm about to share with you was planned meticulously by your father over the past year. He wanted to protect you, but he needed to protect himself as well, at least until the end. Protect himself from Brenda? I said it wasn't a question. Harrison nodded. Your father realized too late, I'm afraid. The true nature of his second marriage. By the time he understood what Brenda was, he was already trapped, in ways that made a simple divorce complicated. What do you mean complicated? Dad had all the money, all the power in that relationship. Harrison smiled sadly. Power isn't always about money, Madison. Brenda had gathered quite a collection of compromising information on your father. Business decisions that, taken out of context, could have been portrayed as unethical. Private struggles after your mother's death that could have damaged his reputation. Nothing illegal, nothing truly wrong, but enough that a vindictive ex-wife could have destroyed the firm he'd built over 30 years. I thought about the changes in my father over the years of his marriage to Brenda. How he'd become more withdrawn, more cautious, less the bold and principled man I'd grown up admiring. So, he stayed with her even though he knew she was toxic. He did. But about 18 months ago, he came to me with a plan. He suspected his health was declining, though he hadn't yet received the formal diagnosis. He wanted to ensure that Brenda would be provided for, as he had promised in their marriage vows, but he was determined that she would not be the one to inherit the Reynolds family home. Harrison opened his briefcase and removed a thick folder. Your father created an irrevocable trust 3 years before he married Brenda. At that time, he transferred ownership of the house to the trust with himself as the beneficiary during his lifetime, and you as the successor beneficiary upon his death. My mind was racing to keep up, but at the will reading yesterday, they will dealt with assets in your father's name at the time of his death. The house was not among those assets, though Brendan never realized this. Your father maintained the fiction that he owned the house, paying for all maintenance and taxes from his personal accounts. The trust arrangement was buried in legal documents that Brenda, despite her business acumen, never thought to investigate. He handed me the folder. These are copies of all the relevant documents. The house is yours, Madison. It has been, legally speaking, since the moment your father died. Brenda has been living there as an unwitting guest for the past week. I opened the folder with trembling hands. There it was in black and white. The Reynolds family trust with me named as trustee and beneficiary. Additional documents showed the transfer of the house to the trust dated 3 years before Dad and Brenda's wedding. But why the charade yesterday? Why let me believe even for a day that I'd lost everything? Harrison's expression turned grave. Your father knew Brenda would fight any direct bequest to you. He feared she might challenge the will, drag you through painful litigation, perhaps even damage the property out of spite if she knew she couldn't have it. He wanted her to reveal her true intentions, which she's done rather spectacularly by immediately putting the house on the market. He reached into his briefcase again and withdrew a sealed envelope. Your father left this for you as well. He asked that I give it to you only after explaining the trust arrangement. The envelope contained a letter written in my father's distinctive architect's handwriting. Precise block letters that had labeled so many blueprints over the years. My dearest Madison, if you're reading this, I'm gone. And Harrison has explained the trust arrangement to you. I hope you can forgive the deception. I couldn't bear the thought of Brenda destroying our family home or using it to manipulate you after I was gone.